So one of the main sources of globalization, of course, is trade. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of trade. Now, the total value, or trade, has increased dramatically since the 1950s. In fact, international trade was only about $58 billion in 1950, and it rose to a high of $16.1 trillion in 2008. So it's something that has been increasing dramatically over the past 60 or 70 years. However, when you look at international trade historically, this wasn't the case. In fact, before 1800, there wasn't much of a world or international economy. In fact, the most industrialized nations in the world at that time, which were predominantly in Western Europe, operated according to a policy of mercantilism, which I talked about a little bit before. Let's see. Now, mercantilism is a policy of increasing national power by managing the economy in such a way to create a trade surplus. What it means is that exports, typically of finished products, are promoted and imports are restricted. The idea was that you could gather enough gold and resources into your country, particularly gold though, through trade, that you could use that to buy an army and then you could crush your neighbors. So the idea was to increase national wealth through trade, therefore exports, reduce the imports, and once the army got strong enough, you could go ahead and attack your neighbors. That was the kind of underlying principle of mercantilism. Now, following the American Revolution, we started to see more and more free trade. However, this kind of golden age of free trade ended with World War I. Basically, the United States, after World War I, said, you know what, we don't want to deal anymore with Europeans or their European problems. And they started the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, which was designed to isolate the United States from global economic problems and, of course, also promote economic sufficiency at home. And that actually brings us up to two different vocabulary terms. And granted, most historians would agree that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was a bad idea because it basically made taxes on imports prohibited so high that imports became prohibitively expensive. That's true. However, at least temporarily, it did seem to raise employment in the United States, but then all the other countries also raised their tariff barriers against the United States, and then there was no market for our exports. So yes, at least in the short run, it promoted employment because we were able to, we as Americans didn't have to compete with foreign products, but once other countries engaged in retaliatory tariffs, then there was less market for our products to be exported. So in the long run, not a good idea. So let's talk about what a tariff is. And a tariff is a tax or a duty levied by a government on goods moving across a border. So usually, for example, I don't know, let's say we are here in the States and we want to have French wine. Well, French wine, as it's coming into the States, has to pay, I don't know, 15% tax on it, which can be used for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this module. Now, another term that came about with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was autarky. And autarky basically means economic self-sufficiency at the national level and total independence from the world economy. So, in other words, the United States during the interwar period thought that the best way to isolate themselves from world economic problems was to produce everything we needed home and not really participate in trade or international markets. That's autarky, national self-sufficiency. Now, after the war, our policy of isolationism stopped. As the U.S., we realized we'd actually need to be a participant in international processes, and the victorious nations, so of course the U.S., France, Britain, and the Soviet Union met in Bretton Woods to forge an agreement. And there are three institutions that are legacies of this agreement. The first is the World Bank. The World Bank has a goal basically to provide developmental loans to countries to help them with infrastructure, to help their economies. The International Monetary Fund also provides access to financial and capital markets designed to stabilize exchange rates. And then there was the International Trade Organization at that time, which eventually became known as the World Trade Organization. And the goal of the WTO is to reduce trade barriers, international trade barriers. And the rules of these organizations were built around a couple of key principles. First of all is what we know as most favored nation status. So most favored nation means that if you extend a single privilege to any member country of the WTO, you have to extend that same privilege to all other countries in the WTO. Let me give an example to illustrate. Let's say the United States is really happy with our friends in France for some reason. We say, you know what? We're going to lower the tariff on imported French wines from 15% to 10%. You can't just say we're only going to lower French wines tariffs from 15% to 10%, because then you'd also have to lower the tariffs on German wine from 15% to 10%, Italian wines from 15% to 10%. So if you extend a privilege to any other member of the WTO, you have to extend that same privilege to all the other members. Now, of course, there's ways around that. You could say we would lower the tariff on champagne from 15% to 10%. But of course, champagne is only produced in the Champagne region in France. So German sparkling wine might not fall under that category, and that therefore German sparkling wine can be 15%, but French champagne would only be 10% because it's a specific product. That's kind of one way around it. Again, politicians always find a way around regulations, right? Then the other one was national treatment. And the national treatment principle means that once a good or has already paid a tariff as it enters the United States, once it's in that country, you cannot tax it again just because it's a foreign good. Let me give an example. Think about when you go to Walmart and you want to buy socks. Okay? Those socks might be made in China. When those socks came in from China and are at the Walmart, there was a duty already paid on those socks when they came into the American market. That duty was paid when they got to port. Now when you come in and you look at those products at Walmart, Walmart can't say, well, we're going to charge another 15% on top of the tariff just because those socks were made in China. No, the tariff has already been paid at the port. You can't charge a tariff again. Now, of course, there's ways around that as well. You could say, well, it's a sock made in China, therefore it doesn't adhere to U.S. safety standards or something like that. But that's a slightly separate issue. Once the tariff has been paid, you cannot charge an additional tariff once it's in the country. Now, one other thing that's kind of a leftover from World War II is the rise of regional trade agreements. The first of all is the European Union, which I'll talk about in a different video. You've also got NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Free Trade Area, or AFTA, and then the Southern Common Market in South and Latin America, Mercosur. And the goal of these is to make even lower trade barriers within these kind of regional areas. So for example, in the European Union, there is no restriction on the movement of capital or people within the European Union. So it's a little bit, it's even a greater example of trade liberalization than that provided by the WTO. So what we're going to do in the next couple of videos is we're going to talk about the pros and cons of free trade and protectionism. Looking forward to seeing you then.